Thank you very much, Charles. A few days ago, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva fulfilled his first 100 days as the new president of Brazil. This is, in fact, the third time he's done this since he had two early presidential terms in 2003 to 2011. So I think the key issue here is, how did the first 100 days go? And what does that tell us about the immediate future for Brazil, say, for the next 1 or 2 years? I've come up with an incredibly crude approach to this issue. And essentially, I've picked on 4 cases in which we might say that Brazil's glass of water is half full. In other words, 4 reasons for optimism about Brazil's future prospects. And I've also come up with 4 cases in which we might say that the glass is half empty, reasons to be pessimistic about how Brazil is going to do. And without further ado, I'm just going to jump in, starting with the optimistic points, and take you on from there. What I hope to do towards the end is look at how these different features interplay between each other, and in a very crude way, set out some possible immediate scenarios for how Brazil might go for the rest of this year and into 2024. So, starting with the reasons for optimism, I'm saying that number one is that there's been a mainly peaceful transition, preserving Brazil's democratic traditions and the rule of law. Number two is that Brazil is returning to international diplomacy. Lula is taking action over deforestation in the Amazon, and this is helping to rebuild Brazil's green credentials in Europe and the United States. The next point, number three, is that in domestic politics, a conservative-dominated Congress is expected to act as a check and balance on government policymaking. And the final cause for optimism is that within the first 100 days, the government has unveiled a new fiscal framework, which it is hoped will gradually reduce the primary fiscal deficit and lower the debt to GDP ratio. What I'll do now is just look at some of those points in a little bit more detail. The fact that there was a peaceful political transition is incredibly important. Brazil has been under democratic rule since 1985, so that means it's getting close to 40 years. And all the transitions have been relatively orderly, but there were deep fears about this last transition. This was partly because Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, a president of the far right who likes to be called the Trump of the tropics, had really raised doubts about whether he would hand over power democratically and peacefully. The former president had been insisting that Brazil's electronic voting system was weak and subject to electoral fraud. And he kind of put himself in a position that said that if he were to lose the elections, the only explanation could be that there was fraud. As a result of that, many of his supporters called for a coup d'etat before the elections, during the elections, or after the elections. So in terms of institutional stability, this was a period of high tension. In the event, however, the elections went ahead. Lula won by a narrow majority, less than 2 percentage points, but he won, and his victory was acknowledged by most players, but not by Bolsonaro, who refused to accept defeat, refused to make any concession. And on the last day of his presidential term, he took a plane and flew to the US, to Florida, where he lived for 3 months in self-imposed exile. Bolsonaro is now back, so we'll talk a little bit later about whether that could destabilize the government or not. The attempted coup did in fact materialize in a manner of speaking. Lula was in office for only 8 days when on January the 8th this year, a mob of his supporters attacked the seat of government in Brasilia. So there were attacks on the Planalto, which is the presidential palace and seat of the executive power. There was an attack on Congress, and there was an attack on the Supreme Court. The security forces reacted half-heartedly. They were quite passive. They let people breach security cordons and actually get into the Planalto, where a lot of destruction took place. And there were some signs that some security officers had been complicit in the whole thing. Lula reacted quite strongly, and in fact, this can be looked upon one of the first successes of his government. So what he did was he immediately sacked quite a few top generals, including the commander-in-chief of the army. He sacked lots of federal police officials. He sacked the head of the Brazilian intelligence agency, and he reorganized its reporting lines to take closer control of it. So I would argue that this quick response to the January the 8th events has actually added to Lula's legitimate authority and credibility. It's a good start. We'll talk about this later as well. It hasn't stopped the political threat to the Lula government, but I believe that it's bought him maybe 6 to 12 months of relative peace. I don't think there will be conspiratorial activity against the Lula government for that period. Beyond that, going into 2024, it will probably depend on how Lula does more generally, how he keeps up his popularity ratings, and how he deals with the economy. So the second point for optimism was the fact that Lula is taking positive action over Amazon deforestation, and as I sort of put it, rebuilding the country's green credentials, which are really important for Europe and the US. And in fact, the bilateral dialogue with the US is now focusing on issues like renewable energy, and the US has signaled it will make donations to the Amazon Fund, a development fund that had been frozen during the Bolsonaro years. I think it's also important to note that, sorry, I'm getting a little disturbance here. I think it's also important to note that the long lasting negotiations between the European Union and Mercosur, the four-country trade pact led by Brazil, may recommence. Those negotiations had effectively been put on hold by France, which objected to Brazil's environmental policies and the deforestation of the Amazon. There is now a possibility that free trade agreement could progress. It may take a while, but that is important because it would give Brazil better access to the European market and stimulate greater competitiveness in the Brazilian economy. The third point I was making is that a conservative-dominated Congress will likely act as a check and a balance on government policymaking. This is quite significant because it means that the Lula government will be nudged, influenced, persuaded to adopt slightly more centrist or moderate economic policies. The numbers are actually really important. In the Chamber of Deputies, the government coalition has only 139 votes out of 513 seats. And in the Senate, the government coalition has only 32 out of 81 seats. So pretty much to do anything, the government will have to negotiate deals with the conservative majority in Congress. It will also be subject to checks and balances, of course, from the Supreme Court or from independent media. And finally, among our reasons for optimism is that these proposals have been made for a new fiscal framework, which would replace the previous cap on real terms annual spending, which had lost credibility and was often subject to waivers. The new approach essentially is quite complicated, but it says that expenditure growth has to be limited to no more than 70% of the growth in revenue. What that means is the government's primary budget will be pushed in the direction of a surplus. In fact, by 2024, a balanced primary budget is expected with a surplus after 2025. This is important for all sorts of reasons, but mainly it's been a problem for the last 10 or 15 years. Brazil has consistently had larger than hoped fiscal deficits. That's built up the debt to GDP ratio to above 70%, and that has acted as a restraining factor on private sector investment in the economy. So at least addressing this issue is a positive sign. If we turn now to a slightly gloomier list of factors, there are four key reasons why Brazil's glass is half empty. These are, first, that threats to Brazilian democracy remain significant. Second, that Lula's attempts to manage a middle role between the US and China as superpower rivals could, particularly his attempts to put himself forward as a peace broker in the Ukraine war, could backfire and lead to a slightly more isolated stance in international diplomacy. I think the important point here is that Lula is basically saying that Russia and the Ukraine bear joint responsibility for the war. And this seems to put him in a position of treating the aggressor and the victim of aggression in the same way, which is rejected by many other countries, of course, rejected by the European Union and the US. And this could be counterproductive in terms of Brazil's attempt to take a renewed leadership role in international diplomacy. A third point, and this is a really important and negative one, is that the new government has failed to win the confidence of local business leaders and international financial markets. Despite, for example, forming a center-right cabinet with a wide range of political appointees within it, and various other efforts that the government has made to build bridges to the private sector, its rhetoric has, particularly Lula's rhetoric, has been pretty much anti-private sector, and there is still a kind of high level of mutual suspicion. Perhaps the biggest example of this is Lula's repeated attacks on the autonomy of the central bank, on the president of the central bank, Roberto Campos Neto, and on the central bank's monetary stance, which is to keep high interest rates in an attempt to squeeze out inflation. The odd thing about this is that if the president really wanted to reduce the autonomy of the central bank, if he really wanted to replace Campos Neto by some other appointee, or if he really wanted to have interest rates sharply reduced, he could sort of try and do all those things by passing legislation in Congress. Of course, he lacks the majority in Congress, so he can't actually change things, which leads on to the question, why is he making so much political noise about something that he can't really change at the moment? One of the explanations for that, which a lot of Brazilian analysts indicate, is that he's doing it to scapegoat the central bank, to make the population blame the central bank for a flat year. Economic growth this year is expected to be 0 or 1%. And Lula is saying, look, it's not the government that you need to blame, it's the central bank and the central bank president. If that is the policy, it does seem rather short-term and opportunist, and it has a high cost because all that political noise has caused more concern in the financial markets and among potential or actual investors in Brazil. Finally, the fourth point about reasons to be cautious or reasons to be pessimistic about Brazil is that relations with Congress will remain difficult. Now, I realize we said previously a point of optimism is that Congress will act as a check and balance on the government. This is a slightly different angle on the difficulty on the relationship with the conservative congressional opposition. The problem is that successive Brazilian governments have formed coalitions in a very, very fragmented political system. So at present, there are 23 different political parties represented in Congress, and the government tries to form a coalition. It has an initial coalition of 6 of those parties and a wider coalition of other parties. And the problem that this government and previous governments, all previous governments, have struggled with is how do you keep these coalitions together, faced by many political parties which are opportunist and which are really after, political benefits in exchange for their vote. So this problem in the noughties, in the first decade of the 20th century, led to a massive scandal known as the Mensalão, the big monthly payment scandal, where it transpired that government budgets were being used to pay members of Congress between $1,000 and $1,500 a month just to ensure that they would vote the right way. The discovery of that scandal led to major investigations and was a big setback for the Workers' Party at the time. If you then go to the 2010s, the second decade of this century, there was an even bigger scandal known as Lava Jato, or the car wash scandal, which was a rather more sophisticated corruption network where the state oil company and other state companies rigged contracts with suppliers, and in return, 3% of the value of the contract was paid to politicians. The Lava Jato scandal was massive in Brazil. It was largely responsible for quite a significant political shift to the right, damaged the Workers' Party, Lula's party. And if you then fast forward again into the last government of Jair Bolsonaro, there was a scandal there as well, known as the secret budget, which again is a way of funneling money for projects run by members of Congress in their home constituencies. And this very large budget, is about $3 billion, was administered with very, very little transparency whatsoever. And in fact, the Supreme Court last December ruled the secret budgets, or what are called rapporteur designated budgets, as being illegal. The question then becomes, and this is quite significant reason for pessimism, the question is, how will Lula in his third presidency try and hold together a congressional coalition? And will that lead to some kind of corruption, which could potentially lead to yet another scandal and a setback for the government? So those are my balance of positive and negative considerations about how the Lula government will do. If we could go to the next slide, I think it's important to make some brief comments on how Lula is doing in the first 100 days of his presidency. So what you've got there is the results of a poll by Datafolha, which shows that 38% of respondents believe that the Lula government is doing well. They give it a good marking. And that compares with 32% for Bolsonaro, when Bolsonaro in 2019 was at his 100 days point. So what that tells us is that Lula is doing better than his predecessor at the same stage in government, although the difference is not that massive. It's quite modest in some ways. Apart from the Datafolha poll, there have been other polls, mainly by INPEC, And if I could just give you a flavor of some of the things that they've turned up, according to INPEC, 41% rate the Lula government as good or great, better than the 34% achieved by Bolsonaro at the same stage in 2019. 57% approve of the way Lula is governing. 53% say they trust the new president, but significantly, 44% say Brazil runs the risks of becoming a communist country. That's an interesting finding because it suggests that Bolsonaro's rhetoric about Lula being a communist, about him being a subversive threat to Brazil as a nation, does seem to have some traction. 44% saying there is this risk of communism is quite significant. The INPEC poll also shows that 51% believe Bolsonaro was not responsible for the events of the 8th of January. What is also clear here is that Lula's third presidency, he is doing much less well than he did in presidencies 1 and 2. After all, in the first and second presidencies, Lula was possibly the most popular Brazilian politician of all time, which is quite something. And he left office in 2011 with something like 60, 70% or even higher approval ratings. So what the polling tells us is that those great old days are still great old days. The reality of governing Brazil now is much more complex and much more difficult, and Lula's sort of infallible popularity is quite fallible and can be eroded. So it's a different kind of ball game, if you like. If we can go to the next slide, the question is, what's next? We're getting close to the half-year point, and we're sort of looking towards the second half of 2023. I think the top of the agenda is going to be the congressional vote on the new fiscal framework, which the government expects by mid-year, but might take longer because of the difficulties of negotiating in Congress. And there's also the big risk that it be watered down. There is a big lurking issue about a major tax reform. This is quite a complicated story because Brazil has, comparatively speaking for Latin America, a high tax burden, but it also has an incredibly complex tax system. Simplifying the system would lead to significant gains for Brazil or companies based in Brazil. So whether that tax reform progresses or not is an important issue. There's also a really big issue about what happens on the right of the political spectrum. Will the right-wing parties regroup and reorganize? Will the leader of the opposition be Jair Bolsonaro, or will he take a step back and possibly be succeeded by his wife, Michelle Bolsonaro, who's a photogenic evangelical Christian, or will the leadership in an alternative scenario go towards more moderate leaders of the right, such as the current governors of Sao Paulo state, Tarcísio Freitas de Lima, or the governor of Minas Gerais, who's Romeu Sema. They might be key figures when we look towards the 2026 presidential elections. Before getting to 2026, there are municipal elections due in October next year, and usually the parties and the individual politicians need to establish a name in the municipal elections, a name and a reputation, before moving on to become potential presidential candidates in 2026. So trying to pull all this together in some way, I've come up with two scenarios. I'm sure there are probably lots more scenarios and more sophisticated scenarios, but these are quite crude ones. And true to the approach I've taken before, there's a sort of a relatively good one and a relatively bad one. So the relatively good one I'm calling Lula muddles through, and his government is good but not fantastic. In this scenario, I would envisage the government reaching agreement with the congressional opposition on a new fiscal framework, say by the second half of this year. I would also suggest that Lula will find some ways to boost spending, maybe increasing the minimum wage, maybe further enhancements to social programs, maybe other measures which would try and push growth up to somewhere above 1%, maybe 1, 2%. He might also be expected to target important electoral swing groups, such as the lower middle class, which, according to polling data, has tended to support Bolsonaro and the right. Lula may try and, if you like, capture them for the government by targeting financial aid or other forms of support. In this relatively positive, good but not fantastic scenario, I also envisage that the government will eventually rebuild bridges with the private sector and financial markets in a way that it hasn't yet been able to or wanted to. It does seem that the fundamental part of Lula's strategy is to attract further investment, and that this will motivate the government perhaps to tone down its anti-business rhetoric, and that has yet to play out. Finally, in this Lula muddle through scenario, we could expect the central bank to eventually start bringing down interest rates at some point in the second half of this year. The Selic benchmark interest rate is currently 13.75%, a bit of a historical high for Brazil. And if the central bank starts beginning to reduce them, that together with some extra spending might, as they say, lift economic growth a little bit and prolong I think calling it a honeymoon period is perhaps too strong, but getting greater economic growth will maintain Lula's popularity for a little bit longer than would otherwise be the case. The less positive scenario I've called Lula in trouble. The old magic is gone. So in this scenario, the president would suffer some international rebuffs. Maybe Brazil's attempt to broker peace talks in Ukraine will fail. It's certainly a very, very hard thing for a country like Brazil to tackle with any success. That might just take a little bit of the international shine off Lula. I would envisage the fiscal framework bill taking longer to get through Congress, and perhaps being heavily amended in a way that convinces the business community that it is not as much of a fiscal anchor as is required. If there are delays, it will also cause trouble for the 2024 budget, which must be approved during the course of this year. And that could see Lula on the defensive. I'd also suggest that, let's say, over the next 12 months, maybe 18 months, there will be a new corruption crisis, which will hurt the government. It's a bit hard to predict something like this, but I think there is a structural vulnerability to corruption in the current relationship between the executive and legislative powers, which will be an underlying threat. It's also possible that global economic growth will be lower than hoped, as a result of which, rather than a year of flat growth pointing towards stronger recovery in 2024, we might have the economy contracting in the second half of this year, and the recovery in 2024 taking longer to come. Finally, I think it's worth reflecting on why Lula was such a popular president in his first two presidencies. And I think that was because of three things. Number one, he delivered economic growth, which was strongly associated with the commodities boom of the first decade of this century. Number two, he was able to use that increased growth and export revenues to redistribute income to favor the middle classes. And number three, again using that extra money, he was able to reduce poverty, launching programs such as Bolsa Familia, that are cash transfer programs to help the poor. I think that Lula has still got that formula for success in mind. He wants growth, he wants redistribution, and he wants poverty reduction, and he thinks that that is a vote-winning combination. However, the big question mark is that the world has changed. Global growth is likely to be slower. China's role as a strong customer for Brazilian soya and iron ore will be less intense than it was before. And Lula has the difficulty of trying to find a successful formula in a less favorable world economy. So that's where I'd like to leave my bit. I think I'm just a little bit over half an hour, so I'm happy to pass on.
Thank you very much. Okay, William, over to you. I think the slides are with you now.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about the economic outlook under Lula. I'm going to start very briefly talking about some of the latest developments and the factors affecting the outlook for the next year or two. Then I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about some of these deeper-seated structural economic problems affecting Brazil's economy, which Andrew's touched upon, and I'll go into how Lula's policy plans play into those. I think the starting point, though, is that Lula is inheriting an economy that is extremely weak. The chart here that I put up here shows the quarter-on-quarter GDP growth rate. And you can see on the right-hand side that over the course of last year, growth slowed sequentially and actually turned negative right at the end of last year. And the economic data we've had for the first few months of 2023 don't really point to much of a turnaround. The good news for Brazil's economy this year, I think the really positive thing has been China's shift away from zero COVID and the impact that's had on commodity prices. China's obviously a massive buyer of most commodities, and particularly some of those that Brazil produces, like iron ore and soybeans. So we upped our commodity price forecast after those developments. And the chart here shows a estimate of the price of Brazil's key commodity exports in US dollar terms. That's based on oil, soybeans, and iron ore. And you can see on the right-hand side that we expect the prices of these to increase by about 10 to 15% over the course of this year, albeit remaining lower than their peaks in 2021 and early 2022. But while there's been positive news in terms of on the external side, the factor really weighing on Brazil's economy that is a headwind and is high interest rates. And the fact that interest rates have gone up so far is weighing on consumers and corporates' debt servicing costs. The Brazilian central bank produces an estimate of the household debt servicing ratio as a share of disposable income, which I put up here. You can see that ratio jumped by about 8 percentage points from its low in 2020 to its recent peak. Is pretty much at a record high. We don't get a similar series for Brazil's corporate sector, but I think if we did, it would look quite similar. And the key point, of course, is that the more income that has to be spent on debt servicing, the less that's available for consumption and investment. And I think this has been a big factor in that slowdown in growth that we've already seen. And then the key question is, how quickly is the central bank going to turn to reducing interest rates? I think the really key thing here is the inflation outlook, and that when we look at that, I think it's hard to see the case building for a rapid reduction in interest rates. Now, the headline inflation rate has actually come down a long way since last year, but that's mainly been because energy inflation has fallen. The key thing here is that the central bank has no control over energy inflation. Core inflation, which looks at underlying inflation pressures, as well as services inflation, has remained very strong. And we see it remaining strong over the coming years. A key factor behind that is developments in the labour market. There's been quite a significant improvement in Brazil's labour market in this recovery, and real wage growth has surged to staggering rates. It's currently at about 15%, which you can see on just at the right-hand side of the chart here. That's one of the highest rates in the last 20 years. Now, the good thing about this surge in wage growth is it has provided a cushion to households. So the chart I showed previously would have looked much worse. The debt servicing ratio would have increased even more sharply had we not seen this increase in wages. But the problem is that this rapid increase in wages is feeding through to core inflation and keeping it quite strong. And that feeds into our forecast that inflation will remain at around somewhere between 4 to 6% for most of the next 12 to 24 months. It's going to remain above the central bank's target, which is shown by these dashed lines here. The central bank appears to be really determined to bring inflation back down to target. It's being very hawkish, and given that desire, no matter what Lula says, I think it's going to be very slow to reduce interest rates. So we see about interest rate cuts only in the final quarter of this year, maybe 100 basis points of cuts, and maybe 200 more in 2024. That's quite a lot of cuts compared to a developed market like the UK or US, but it would only reverse maybe a quarter of the total tightening that we saw in 2021 and 2022. So to me, that suggests that high interest rates and high debt servicing costs are going to remain a problem for Brazilian firms and corporates going into well into next year. And with that drag, we see GDP growth remaining at 1%, both in 2023 and 2024. I don't quite share the optimism of the consensus views, which are shown by the X's on the forecast area here, that growth will accelerate next year. I think at that point in 2024, we're still going to be seeing the cost of high interest rates. And also at that point, I think this recovery in China that we've seen following the end of zero COVID may be starting to fizzle out, weighing on commodity prices. So it looks like a pretty subdued growth outlook for Brazil's economy in the coming years. And I think that also segues quite neatly to some of the structural problems in Brazil's economy. Now, one of those, perhaps one that gets most attention, is the fiscal problem. And Andrew talked a lot about that, and I'll come to that too. But I think the underpinning everything is a growth problem. So Brazil had this period of staggeringly quick growth, unprecedented for many decades in Lula's first and second terms between 2003 and 2010. It was helped by China's opening up and extremely rapid growth and its voracious demand for commodities. But really, since about 2013, Brazil's growth record has been woeful. So you can see from this chart, which shows the level of GDP, that the latest level of GDP is really no higher than it was at its peak in 2014. And GDP is some 30% lower than it would have been had GDP continued to grow at the same rate seen in the 2000s, shown by that dashed line. I think what's interesting is, if you look at that, the downturn caused by the COVID pandemic in 2020 is only a relatively minor blip in this pretty atrocious growth performance. There are lots of factors that can explain that weakness. The downturn in commodity prices in the middle of the last decade, no doubt, played a really important role. But I think underlying everything is a productivity problem, essentially how much output is being generated by a worker and how quickly that's growing. And that was a problem even during those green years. So this chart shows growth in productivity per year between 2003 and 2010 for a range of large emerging markets. And you can see Brazil sits on the right-hand side. Productivity growth was about 1.5%. One of the weakest of any of these large emerging markets, and far behind rapidly growing countries like China and India. And that performance was even worse in the last decade. I think if we were to do the corresponding figure for the previous decade, the number would be negative. We could probably spend the whole hour session talking about the reasons behind this productivity problem, but I would distill it to three. One is inadequate skills in the labour forces. Lots of surveys suggest that Brazilian firms find it quite difficult to attract the workers with the right skills for the jobs they need. Another is a lack of competitive forces in the domestic economy. There are various reasons behind this. One that Andrew mentioned is the tax system, which imposes a very high regulatory burden. Another is that there are high import tariffs, which protect many Brazilian firms from foreign competition, don't force them to make productivity gains. And the third factor is a low investment rate. Brazil has one of the lowest investment rates and has had of any major emerging market economy. Again, you put lots of factors. One I would highlight as a reason behind that is high interest rates in Brazil's economy. They're high at the moment, but they've historically been quite high. And behind that is Brazil's history of high and volatile inflation, which has kept interest rates high. So how do Lula's policies play into this? There's a slight risk of cherry picking here, but I think we can point to some areas where really I think the balance points to things taking a step backwards in terms of ameliorating these factors that are holding back productivity. One is the attacks on the central bank's independence, this desire for lower interest rates from Lula. Given everything I've said earlier, hardly surprising that he's worried about the impact high interest rates are having. And I think Andrew made a really good point that he seems to be scapegoating the central bank for this weakness. He's not actually taking the policies to change the head of the central bank and try and force lower interest rates. But even then, it is exerting a high cost on the economy. So one way of showing this is through what's happening to inflation expectations. This chart's slightly complicated, so please bear with me. But the blue line here shows actual inflation less the central bank's target, which corresponds to the left-hand axis. So a higher number means inflation is further above target. I've measured it this way because the target's changed over the years. And the black line shows analyst 12-month ahead inflation expectations. Typically, they've moved together. When inflation's fallen, inflation expectations have declined. But you can see on the right-hand side that I've circled that inflation expectations have risen even though inflation's fallen. The central bank's become increasingly concerned in its recent communications that inflation expectations are unanchored. It's hard not to believe that Lula's rhetoric has played a role in that development. And we've seen worrying movements in terms of long-term borrowing costs too, related to Lula's policies and the shift in inflation expectations. Most bond yields have risen, raising borrowing costs for the government and the private sector. Another area where Lula has moved, he appears to be taking an more interventionist stance in the economy. He's talked of rolling back the fuel price liberalization introduced about 5 years ago, which would reduce the role of market forces in the economy. Another area that appears to be close to his heart is increasing the role of the State Development Bank, BNDES, in the economy, providing subsidized lending to targeted sectors. That was a key feature of Lula's second term, less so his first term, where he took a more pragmatic stance. But in his second term, BNDES lending increased significantly. There's a lot of academic research on the impact of this lending. Most of it suggests that it helped to the companies that received subsidized lending to expand their revenues, but there seemed to be very little impact on productivity. One argument I've seen put forward is that subsidized lending was used to purchase lower quality capital goods compared with companies that were purchasing capital goods with lending derived at market interest rates. So potentially a concerning development there. And the final point is had by this point, maybe it was a bit too optimistic around the time of the election, but I had hoped by this point we might have seen a bit more movement on trade liberalization and tax reform. I know perhaps it was naive of me. Reforms in Brazil take a very long time to make progress, but I thought we might have seen the EU-Mercosur deal make a bit more progress by this point. We might have seen tax reform see the light of day and remove some of that regulatory burden for Brazilian firms. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed we'll see these developments soon, but is perhaps moving a bit more. Lula could have perhaps moved more quickly in this direction had he really wanted to get investors on board. So far, we're really not seeing signs of progress in the areas needed to tackle the productivity problem. The other kind of structural area that I wanted to address is the fiscal problem. Andrew already talked quite a lot about this. The debt to GDP ratio has really surged since 2013 as economic growth slowed. There was a brief reduction in the debt to GDP ratio from 2021, helped by the rebound in GDP after the pandemic, as well as high commodity prices. But the forecast shown on the right-hand side here shows kind of no policy settings unchanged scenario in which the debt to GDP ratio starts returning to that inexorable upwards rise. Lula has sort of given something for everyone in terms of fiscal policy. His initial moves, actually even before he took power, alarmed investors. He wanted to extend social welfare spending into this year, which was approved. But then more recently, he introduced this new fiscal rule. I've put up some of the key targets, the key points here. I think there are. I won't go into that in detail, but I think there are a couple of points I would make. One is that the impact on expenditure growth allows for it, which is limited to 70% of the previous year's revenue, but it must be within a range in which real expenditure growth is 0.6 to 2.5%, allows for more spending than the previous fiscal rule, where real expenditure growth could not be higher than zero. The other point is that the government has ambitious budget targets, which it must be met as part of this rule to get a balanced primary budget and then run surpluses. But they can only really do that if revenues rise sharply. Now, they've talked about raising revenues of about 1.5% of GDP, but there's a big risk that these get watered down in these policies don't make it through Congress or make it through in a watered down form, or that and the revenue policies they are talking about are generally based around closing tax loopholes, and that possibly it seems quite plausible to me that the increase in revenues might not be as large as the government hopes. The next couple of slides just put some figures or just illustrate the impact of the new fiscal rule. The chart here shows what's actually happened to real government expenditure, as well as the range in blue that would be permitted by this new rule. I think the important point is it would prevent the very rapid rises in expenditure seen under Lula's government in the 2000s, which you can see on the left-hand side, as well as under the Dilma government in the early 2010s. But like I say, it would in principle be less restrictive, than the fiscal rule it's replacing. So it all comes down to whether they can raise revenues. If they can do that and they can meet the budget targets that they've set out, I think they can stabilize the debt position. Our modeling is shown for that scenario, shown with the black line on the right-hand side of this chart. Until I see hard evidence of revenues rising, and these policies being introduced and revenues rising, we remain somewhat skeptical. We've not changed our forecast for the government debt to GDP ratio. Now, one just final point I would make on this point is this isn't an immediate disaster for Brazil's economy. It's a slow burning debt crisis. Brazil is not Argentina. And that because of the structure of its debt, around 95% or so is held in its local currency and is held by the domestic investor base that has been able to finance large budget deficits in the past. It can continue to do this for a long time. The problem instead is that as that debt ratio rises, the interest rate on government borrowing is going to increase and increase. The government's going to face higher interest rate costs, ultimately the fiscal austerity that will be needed to stabilize the debt ratio will become larger. And as interest rates for the government increase, private sector borrowing costs are going to increase too. So it's quite a difficult situation that could be facing Brazil if that debt ratio continues to rise. That will mainly materialize in the form of lower GDP growth. Just before I hand back to Charles for the Q&A, I'm just going to summarize quickly. So in our forecasts, we're expecting high interest rates to keep GDP growth subdued at about 1% this year and next. Lula so far is looking, particularly in terms of the policies he's pushed so far, is looking a bit more like his second, more interventionist term, and perhaps a bit more like the Dilma term that followed him than his first, more pragmatic term that many had hoped for when he was elected. It seems so far like we've seen a step backwards in terms of the policies that are needed to raise productivity and lift GDP growth. Although I would acknowledge that this new fiscal rule is a positive step, but I think we and many other economic analysts are waiting to be convinced that it's going to be implemented in full. There seem to be lots of stumbling blocks here. And on that rather downbeat note, I'll hand back to Charles.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. We've got about 5, maybe 10 minutes for questions maximum. I wonder, Andrew, if you can answer 2 questions which are perhaps related, but only because they involve China. One is, should the West be concerned about Lula's turning towards China purportedly as a member of BRIC? And secondly, can you see the historic problems concerning the supply of Brazilian soya to China as well?
Thank you, Charles. Yes, I think the turn towards China is significant. It's been, I think it's the last decade, China has been Brazil's #1 trade partner, ahead of the United States, which has been down in #2 position. This, you can argue that governments of different political color in Brazil have all ended up trying to boost trade with China on pragmatic, non-ideological basis. Certainly that happened during the Bolsonaro government, who was intensely ideologically opposed to the Chinese Communist Party, but who had to live with the fact that a large part of Brazil's trade is with China and is based on exports of things like soya and iron ore and beef and so on. I think the concern sort of in the question is most acute in the case of Ukraine, because you can argue that Brazil, in pursuit of its own interest, in pursuit of a kind of a middle way between the two superpowers, is really being a bit hypocritical. It's been put this way: Brazil defends its democracy and its sovereignty quite strongly, but it is by presenting Russia and Ukraine as somehow equally responsible for the war, it is in fact denying support for democracy in Ukraine and for the self-determination of the Ukrainian people. Basically, it's kind of ignoring the fact that in this case, Russia was the aggressor. It's quite interesting to see how this will play out. You could say that, any negotiation means you have to face things you don't really want to follow through ideologically, if you know what I mean. So you could argue in Brazil's defense that at least it's trying to get some sort of peace talks going. The contrary view is that its lack of solidarity over issues such as democracy is a problem and is going to lead to more difficult relationships with the United States and with the European Union. In terms of the second question, I'm not entirely sure what historic problems George is referring to, but I think just as a kind of general point, Brazil is the world's largest soya producer, and China is a key market, there are some indications that because the Chinese economy is no longer growing at 7, 8, 9%, that over the longer term, Chinese demand for Brazilian soya may reduce. On the short term, however, the weather factors are such that Brazil is expecting an absolute record soya harvest at the same time as Argentina is expecting one of the lowest in recent decades. And this is to do with the fact that Argentina is suffering an intense drought, whilst in Brazil, growing conditions are much more favorable. I'm not sure if George wants to ask a supplementary about which historic problems he was referring to.
Okay, we'll carry on. If he wants to, he can write in the questions. Perhaps we can move on then to either William or Andrew asking a question from Scott, who says that is there anything other than rhetoric in Lula's revival of the condemnation of the US dollar as a reserve currency? And is this linked to his attacks on the central bank? William, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I'm very happy to start with that. I think, it's a really interesting couple of questions there. I think the talk about the dollar and the central bank are the slightly distinct points. The attacks on the central bank are primarily to do with the local interest rates in Brazil that are so high and having this impact on households and corporates. The criticism of the use of the dollar in international trade is clearly another issue that's worrying Lula. It's not the kind of issue that is really having any immediate impact on the economy. It seems to be, like Scott said, mainly a rhetorical issue. But it's certainly possible, given China's interest in internationalizing the use of the renminbi, and the moves we saw when Lula was in Beijing to establish renminbi settlement for payments. So Brazil could start to use the renminbi a bit more frequently in international trade. I doubt it sort of replace the dollar, but you could see it being used a bit more, and China exerting its influence, particularly in its commodity trade with Brazil.
Okay, Andrew, George has come back and talked about the Chinese developing a reputation for rejecting Brazilian soya on the for both in terms of both quantity and quality. It generated significant trade difficulties. Do you want to comment on that?
To be honest, I don't think I can add anything additional to his clarification, because I'm not quite sure if there are any new developments in the way the quality of Brazilian soya is being assessed in China. I think, however, that the relationship is really important. Brazilian soya growers depend very largely on the Chinese market, and there will therefore be a desire, a political will to reach agreement on quality standards. I should also mention in passing that there's been a recent issue in the cattle and beef sector where there's been what's called an atypical case of mad cow disease, BSE, which led China to stop all imports from Brazil. This has now subsequently been resolved. The Chinese government has accepted that it is an atypical case, i.e. not a full-scale outbreak. And during Lula's visit to China in the last few days, the Chinese, in fact, just before it, they said that imports of Brazilian beef could resume.
Okay. If I may add something just very, very quickly on this, if we've got a moment.
Yeah.
But I think if we're thinking about supply of soybeans to China from an international relations perspective, there are only a few countries that produce in major quantities: the US, Brazil, and to a lesser extent Argentina. Argentina, like Andrew said, has drought, but otherwise, China's relations with Brazil are a lot warmer than they are with the US. So I think that, if anything, works in Brazil's favor. albeit there's a caveat that their harvesting seasons occur at very different times of the year. I think the bigger risk for Brazil in terms of its supply of soybeans to China is there have been guidelines issued in China to reduce the use of soybeans in pig feed, which is the primary use of the soybeans that China imports from Brazil. It's unclear actually how that's progressing and how quickly it will happen, but if it does gather momentum, then that's potentially a longer-term structural headwind to Brazil's soybeans exports.
Okay, there's another question here from Scott. Any thoughts on Lula and Petrobras? He does seem to want to make his an arm of the presidency. Do either of you have any comments on that?
Yes, I've got a comment, Charles. I think most Brazilian presidents like having a strong and profitable Petrobras, and want to influence it to support various schemes or ideas that they're pursuing. I think the interesting one in the current relationship between Lula and Petrobras is that Lula is very eager for Petrobras to pay out more money in the form of dividends, which he sees as a potential boost to try and get that economic growth rate up again. So that's part of the issue. The other related part of the issue is to what extent there are subsidies for petrol prices at the pump. And at the moment, despite having inherited some temporary subsidies from the previous government, the Lula administration has not committed itself to making major subsidies, which is, if you like, a good point from the point of view of the business community, but it's not quite clear how long that position will last.
Okay, I'm going to ask one question here. In terms of Lula's political situation within Congress and the alliance with the center-right, how strong is that, and how easily do you see it fracturing, Andrew?
I think it's quite easy for it to fracture, based on the fact that what Congress has is lots of small and rather opportunist political parties. So some of that, if you like, that negotiation is already baked in, because on taking office, in fact, before taking office, Lula had to try and build a congressional majority on certain issues. Interestingly, for example, there are 3 deputies who are members of União Brasil, which is a center-right political parties. And one of them at least, who is the Minister of Tourism, has already faced allegations of corruption. And so far, Lula has stood by him. He was accused of arranging the tarmacking of roads near family-owned property in Maranhão state, and of basically fiddling his travel expenses. And so far, and União Brasil is important because it helps deliver the kind of majorities that Lula needs to aspire to. And so far, Lula has said that nothing has been proven against the tourism minister, and he will only act if something is proven. But I think that the real issue here is that if you are a small party with valuable votes in Congress, you have an opportunity to ask for a political quid pro quo from the Lula government. You say, of course we are supporting you and we're giving you our votes. What are you giving us in return? We'd like, this. We'd like to be considered for this appointment, for these jobs in the government bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. So I think it comes back to, I think, my main argument, which is that the relationship between the president and Congress will be critical to how the Lula government evolves over the next 1 or 2 years.
Okay. Any final comment, William, before we stop?
I would, don't really have very much to add. I think the one point I would add is there is, from an economic side, with that fragile coalition, it increases the incentive for Lula to increase spending, and highlights the fragility of this new fiscal rule which they're implementing. So it looks quite like it's going to be quite a difficult situation.